Thanks, Philip. Tony.
Thank you. I'd just like to begin by reinforcing what John said and around the adoption of GM crops around the world. It has become the fastest adopted technology in crop production in recent history. And just to put that into some perspective, over half the world's population, about 4 billion people, live in about 30 countries that currently grow GM crops. So is New Zealand missing out on the opportunities presented by genetic engineering? Clearly our farmers are, because we don't grow these crops. And they're clearly limited in their international markets by not having the advantages offered by the production efficiencies and quality offered by GM crops that can be afforded to other countries reliant upon exporting food. However, the New Zealand food industry and the consumers, as pointed out by John, already benefit from the importation of GM products from GM crops. There's a total of 83 different GM events in 9 crops that are approved for consumption here in New Zealand. And given that 80% of the world's soybean are GM and 70% of the world's cotton is GM, and the fact that GM oils and fibre are not well segregated around the world and do not require labelling, it is highly probable that such products are a very common component of our food industry here in New Zealand. And in fact, if we wanted to ignore such crops, we'll probably be driving up the prices of food trying to find alternatives, and we'll be very severely limited in the food diversity that we currently enjoy. The regulatory system on GM throughout the world is based on the perception that GM crops pose new environmental or food safety risks. It's clearly impossible for science to give 100% assurance that GM crops have no impact on environment or food safety from that kind of perspective. The concerns about the safety assurances on GM crops usually arise from a lack of understanding of the genetics that underpin the development of crop cultivars by traditional breeding. This completely overlooks the fact that many human-induced genetic modifications are already apparent in many of our modern-day crop cultivars, things such as chemical or radiation-induced mutations, chromosome rearrangements, manipulation of a number of chromosome sets, the transfer of large chromosomal regions from numerous wild species into our major crop plants via traditional breeding, even the development of totally artificial crop species or the domestication of some new crop species. Now I want to finish by actually reading you 2 sentences, and I wrote these sentences over 20 years ago, and with the wealth of science information that's been generated over the last 2 decades, I think they have real substance in terms of the way we can embrace these 2 sentences nowadays. And those 2 sentences were, the first one was, for most GM characters, the risk of GM crops to natural ecosystems, agricultural ecosystems, food industries and consumers will be no different than the effects of growing, processing and eating new cultivars from traditional breeding. And then furthermore, this is where I feel quite emphatic about nowadays as opposed to 20 years ago, the precision and power of molecular biology offers greater confidence of achieving and monitoring the desired outcomes of GM crops relative to traditional breeding. So I want to finish up by reading you a quote, which I believe is just a bit of a reality check on the biosafety of crop plants. And this quote says, "We have recently advanced our knowledge of genetics to the point where we can manipulate life in a way never intended by nature. We must proceed with the utmost caution in the application of this newfound knowledge." And that's a quote from Luther Burbank, a prolific plant breeder, way back in 1906, shortly after the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's principles of heredity. And I think there's a bit of deja vu coming through there.
Thanks, Tony. Rob.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm not going to pretend I've got all the answers, but I'd like to tell you some of the things that do worry me about GE and some of the things that don't worry me. So firstly, I'm not really worried about food safety with regards to GM. I haven't seen any credible evidence that GM food provides any food safety issues that can't be dealt with the usual ways that new foods are brought to market. So I'm not too worried about food safety, but I am worried about a few other things. One of them is the unintended ecological consequences of GM technology. Ecosystems are complex things with many interacting partners. It's very difficult to predict what a change to that system is going to do. And so I think we should be concerned about unintended consequences. And particularly so in New Zealand, where we are familiar with the consequences of introducing exotic animals and plants to this country. It's something we should keep in our minds when we're weighing up the pros and cons of genetic technology. Another thing I'm worried about is food security. So on a global scale, we have a growing population that needs to be fed. And there are a number of ways we could approach that. We could put more land into agricultural production, or we could intensify our agriculture. So once we've dealt with issues like food waste and distribution, we're left with the need to intensify our agriculture, and to do it in a way that leaves enough land left over for biodiversity and all of the ecosystems that it provides. So in that respect, GM may be part of the solution. And the third thing I'm worried about is who actually controls genetic technology. So I think that if we back away, though, from GM in New Zealand, we risk leaving it in the hands of corporations overseas. And so I think that that's an argument for investing public money in genetic technology and research. And so I don't want to see something happen in New Zealand like happened in America with stem cell research, where for ideological reasons, stem cell research was not funded publicly, and that had all kinds of consequences for American science. And I don't want to see that happen in New Zealand with GE. So some of those things are on one side of the argument, some of them are on the other. I think we have to weigh up all the risks, the benefits and the costs in each case, and come to a consensus that involves everyone in making a decision in each case on whether to adopt any particular genetic technology or not. So I'm possibly less certain than some of the other panel members.
But you are the first one to get a round of spontaneous applause.
I'll take
Those
that.
are the breaks. Richard.
I just want to cover a couple of points that haven't been raised yet, rather than going through my pre-prepared dialogue. The first point is that since the Royal Commission some 13 years ago, the technologies we're talking about today are not quite the same as they were back then, and that is they've moved on, if you like. We've moved on from version 1.0, if you like. We've now sort of GM's, there's new kinds of tools in the toolkit. And they get around a lot of the criticisms of the early genetic modification technologies, that they were imprecise, that we didn't know where in the genome these genes were going, and we were adding lots of other bits of DNA into the genome. So we now have very precise tools to turn genes on and off. Technologies like RNA interference, which is a technology which can turn an individual gene precisely off if you want to. There are also new technologies, even more newer, that can make single mutations in a specific place within the genome that we can target. So that means that rather than just putting in a piece of genetic material randomly into a genome, we can precisely target where that material goes within the genome. So that was one of the early criticisms of genetic modification technology, that it was a random kind of technology in terms of introducing genetic material. And my point is that with any kind of technology there will be continuous improvement. So again, they will be improvements in the technology or ability to control more precisely. So it's fair to say that rather than, we started off with a sledgehammer, and I think now the tools are more analogous to scalpels that we have, and that will change over time as well. The other point I like to make is actually, I work for Plant and Food Research, and we have a policy on genetic modification, and if you go to our website you can see that policy, and it's and we had it was developed through a consultative process with our staff. And so, I challenge everyone here, they can go and develop their own policy on genetic modification and put it up there and continue to, and sort of contribute to the debate that we're having today in other forums. So I think, engagement is really important within your organisations and between your organisations. So I really applaud having this debate. But one thing I want to pull out is that Plant and Food, from that policy, is that Plant and Food will not seek to develop genetically modified cultivars for commercial release without the clear public support of the relevant New Zealand industry sectors, as well as commercial and research relationships with a clear benefit to New Zealand. So that echoes what we heard before from industry, that if we don't see that our industries can see that their customers want genetic modification technology, then there's no need for us to be developing it. But we will defend the right to maintain that option for our industries, because never say never, there might be something around the corner where genetic modification might be the only solution to the problem, and it's, I would argue that it's within our remit to provide those options, and GM is one of those options potentially to saving these industries if a problem comes along. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rob. Richard. I was just thinking earlier that the problem with genetic modification is that, and your applause a little earlier for Rob indicated that I was right to think this, damn it. That people have no reason to believe that GM foods are being created for anyone's benefit other than the multinationals. And I have a feeling, and your questions later may prove me wrong, that there is a general acceptance that the health issues are sorted. In the scientific community, the safety debate seems over. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the US National Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry Safety Study Review, to name probably just a few, all say there are no health problems. So it comes back to control, it comes back to choice, and it comes back to perceived benefit. You can argue with that summation later. But just let me take you through a few of the things that puzzled me. John, apart from saying you can't predict the future, give me a break. You guys. Anyway, as president of the New Zealand Institute of Agricultural and Horticultural Science in 2010, you said the case for GM being needed to feed the world was not useful for New Zealand's high-value aspirations, plus whether there is currently a world food shortage is debatable. Now, you're saying linking GM food with alleviating hunger via increasing food supply is an issue. You've changed your argument. This seems opportunistic, to say the least.
No, I don't think I've changed my argument. It is only one solution to improving food supply. We have improved...
To what? A solution to what?
To improving food supply.
But there is no... 2010, you said there isn't a food supply problem. It's a matter of distribution.
That's partly true. I mean, I don't think there is a food supply problem in many parts of the world, but I think there is in some parts of the world. And as we get greater geopolitical stability, I think that problem is being resolved.
Where's the sign of greater geopolitical stability?
It's not
Remind
my
me.
figures. I think, as I said, when you look at the Middle East, I'm not convinced there is, but we're told by the FAO and by the World Health Organization that it is, and that is one of the underlying reasons. It's not my figures.
No, but are you saying that that's due to genetically modified food?
No.
Well, let us not become confused. What are you saying?
I'm saying that